Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today I want to talk a little bit about moving towards growing more food at home and being able to rely more on the food that you have grown. Because one of the challenges that we often face when we're trying to, really supplement the food that we're buying from the grocery store is it doesn't always go quite to plan, and there's a few things that you can do as a gardener to try and help you through when things don't go right. So let's dig in and talk about some of those things. So step number one is having a plan, because we need a plan for a successful garden when we're looking at really being able to provide food for our family. A plan is really, really important, right? What are we growing? When is it likely to be harvested? When are we going to be transplanting? Knowing those days to maturity for the plants that you are growing is going to really help you kind of know and be able to figure out like the space that's being used in the garden, but also, the key bit really is, when things are likely to start being ready for harvesting for you and your family, because you're going to need to be thinking sort of longer term when you're wanting to move more to, really growing your own food and not relying on the grocery store. Because, we're used to going into the store and, if you want an apple, there's apples year round. Well, when you're growing it yourself, apples are not available all the year round, right? So knowing when pollination happens and when you can start to expect that first fruit being available is going to really help you figure out what are the gaps that you have in terms of food not being available, and those when you are going to be abundant. Right now, as I'm recording this episode, it's in July, so this probably is going to be going out in August, but canning season is probably already here for a lot of you, and that's really when, things kind of get busy on the homestead, is when you've got new plantings going in for fall, but you're also harvesting things and you want to preserve them to make sure that you have enough to kind of see you through those times of the year when you're unable to grow things because of winter, you don't have, a heated greenhouse, all of these things, right? So having a really solid plan is going to help you figure out this time of year, usually between sort of December and spring, that's like when there's not a lot of fresh produce coming out of the garden, and then you can either start to plan to have more plants, so you're going to have a bigger surplus that you can then preserve, whether it's freezing, drying, canning, whatever method that you choose. Or you can look to be growing vegetables that have a quicker day to maturity, maybe looking at season extension to protect them so they're going to come in and grow a little bit quicker. Maybe look at some perennials, because perennials tend to be coming up a lot sooner than the annuals. So for example, sorrel is a leafy green. It's part of the spinach family, and it tends to have a very early flush of growth, and it's one of the first kind of salad greens that appear in my garden, and that's because it's a perennial, so it comes back year after year. But it's something that my family kind of relies on now, is like that's our very first spring salad is sorrel, but it also goes great in an omelette with eggs, and there's lots of different ways to use it, but kind of knowing these things about your garden and when those gaps are, you can really start to plan veggies that are going to fill those things. So for example, many of the brassicas, but in particular purple sprouting broccoli, obviously I'm English and that's very much a spring favorite in the UK, but it's incredibly expensive, but it's very, very easy to grow at home, especially if you're in a milder climate like the UK is, because you would plant those in fall as transplants and then leave them in the ground, and then come very early spring, they're putting in a lot of this like fresh growth. You can eat some of the leaves, you can eat, the little buds that are coming off. Those are particularly good when they're steamed and dipped in an egg. Oh, yeah, I do miss those. Especially from, fresh eggs from the chickens that we were raising. Oh, they were so good. But, purple sprouting broccoli is very much traditionally what was known as a hungry gap vegetable, because it bridged that gap between, really your harvests coming in spring and the last ones that were coming through for winter. So it's good to kind of do a bit of research around some of these traditional veggies and how they were used, because, more often than not, there was vegetables that were being grown in that way for those reasons. And often the varieties that are used in those kind of traditional fashions, they don't look pretty, right? They're not, grocery store, kind of model fashion, right? They're not ones that you would really readily pick out if you were at the grocery store, right? Because consumers want things that are uniform. They want it to be the same size, the same shape, same colors, right? They want that uniformity because that's kind of how the grocery stores have conditioned us. But when you start to look back at these heirloom varieties, there's a lot more diversity that's there, and things look a lot different. So beets, for example, beets are an amazing vegetable. They keep incredibly well in a root cellar, and the ones that keep best are these like ginormous roots that look like, they look like something out of The Enormous Turnip, which is a kid's book. But they're massive, and they kind of look a little warty and gnarled, but they keep incredibly well and they taste amazing. So if you're really wanting to kind of get in and have food for your family, year round, and whether it's through kind of these traditional cold storage methods or, some more modern preserving methods like canning and stuff, look at what some of these traditional heirlooms were and how they were being used, because you can use that knowledge and, try and get hold of those varieties to be able to, really thrive in your garden for the next season. Now, one of the other pitfalls that kind of happens when growing your own food is that we tend to only rely on one variety. And as I was just kind of talking about, having different varieties for different seasons or different uses is actually really, really valuable in a garden where you're trying to grow your own food. So let's take beets again, right? There's, these kind of big old mango storage beets, right? These giant things. But then there's also these really, tender, delicate baby beets that are perfect for salads and fresh eating. So you can eat tons of the baby beets, although you might not want to eat tons of them. But let's say, you've got like a really good, successional harvest going of your baby beets, but you're leaving your big old storage beets, right, until very last minute where you're going to harvest them and then put them in the cool storage before the frosts get too bad and the ground freezes, but you're still able to enjoy beets throughout the season. Corn is another one where there's different varieties, right? You've got your sweet corn, but then you've also got your field corn varieties, and your field corn varieties are very much things like your popcorn, your flint corn, your dent corn, right? Ones that you use to make polenta or grits or popcorn, right? Lots of different uses, but your fresh corn, your sweet corn, you want to be eating early. So being able to understand that there's different types and different uses of a particular plant, and then knowing some of the other varieties that are available, you can really make use of not only having like a longer harvest season, but you can also then have corn for different purposes, or plants for different purposes that are going to see you through different times of the year, right? You want field corn if you're wanting to be making your own tortillas, for example, right? You're not going to be able to do that with sweet corn. It doesn't have the right properties that are there. And having an understanding of that is really helpful when you're looking through those seed catalogs in, fall and winter, or if you're trying to be on a seed swap with somebody, right? Knowing the difference between the types of vegetable that you're looking for, or, even knowing the variety, right? Because you've done a bit of research and you're like, oh, I really want this particular variety. That's going to really help. I mean, I've been on so many seed swaps through Facebook, and people very much know the varieties that they're looking for, and I'll often say, I'm looking for this particular variety of a vegetable. If anybody has it, I'm willing to swap these varieties of things, and sometimes you'll get a surprise in there too, which is kind of cool. But that's a really great way to be able to help diversify your garden, diversify your seeds, and, be able to have a variety of things that are going to be coming in season when your garden is growing, right? So, back to what I was saying earlier, knowing when those gaps are and how to fill those gaps, and the way that you fill those gaps that you have in your plan is based on the number of days to maturity. So how long does it take for this variety to grow and become, ready for harvest, and also the space that you have available in your garden. So knowing, I have these salad greens coming in, and they should be all ready for harvest on, let's say April 15th, right? They're ready on April 15th. And then after April 15th, I could let them continue growing so I could get a different harvest, or I could, harvest them all at that point, and then I could plant something else into that space, right? Add some more compost in and plant something else there that's going to continue growing after the frost has passed. And then that's a way that you can start to get more out of the space that you have by successfully planning and placing plants as they're getting ready. So for example, I could take out all of those lettuces and I could be putting in summer squash or winter squash, right? And really use that space for something else. I could also resow more quick growing vegetables in that same space, and then I'm really using more of the space that's available to grow even more. So knowing the days to maturity of what you are growing, this is where the power in planning really comes in, because if you have these different varieties and you know the days of maturity for each of these, then you can start to really hone in and plan and figure out, on these dates, this is when I should be transplanting into the garden or sowing the seed, and by this date, this is when I should be getting a harvest, and I have up to this date to be doing that and adding successional harvests right up until this point, because after this point there's not enough days left between the frost starting again in fall for us to get a successful harvest. And this is really powerful and helpful for you to know, because that's going to help you set your garden from being kind of like a hobby garden to really being able to supplement what you are growing and feeding your family with. And it's also, really helpful to know this, because this is a good opportunity for you to kind of trial different varieties in the garden and keep really good notes in your garden journal. Because if you have a variety that is growing so much better, then that might be one that you want to start to use more in your planning and rotation, because it's a lot more reliable for you to be growing. And it's definitely something you should consider saving seed from. All right, so let's just recap. First of all, we're going to need a plan. We need a very solid plan. We need to know our days to maturity of the plants that we're going to be growing. We need to know what varieties and types are available, and whether we're going to be growing for fresh eating or for storage or preserving. So there are some of the key points that we need to know. What else do we need to know to have a successful garden? Well, one of the things where we often fall down is not planning for pests. For those of you that are in the Facebook Facebook group, you will have seen the lovely cabbage that I had that had been eaten by snails. And when you're trying to grow food for you and your family, you really need to take into account that there is going to be some loss, right, in the garden. You are going to lose some to disease, some to pests, right, and then some you're going to be able to harvest. So however many plants that you're planning per person, you need to add an overage on there. So you need to be planning and planting out more plants than what you're going to need to be able to account for that. So for example, let's take cabbages, right? And we're going to assume that, we want 1 cabbage per person for 3 weeks, right? So if that's a family of 3, then that'll be 3 times 3, right? So now we know the number of cabbages, and then what do you put like as an allowance for, pests or whatnot? Well, it kind of depends for that. I usually like to plan an overage of like 20, maybe even 40%. So I would plan like an extra couple more plants to be able to account for some of that loss. Some seed companies, particularly those who are supplying for market farmers, they have a rate of, kind of expected loss in the field to then account for. And they have these kind of fancy sheets that you can use to then plan an overage, right? It might be, an 80% overage rather than, a 40% overage. But you can use those numbers to help give you a little bit of a guide in what you need to plan. But this is why it's really important to take notes in your garden of what grows well and what doesn't, and kind of how many things you've lost for, plants growing or pests coming in and stuff like that, because then you're able to really hone in on what your garden grows like and what the losses are for you, because then that way you're not wasting seed, you're using the very best that you have available, and you're going to be able to make better use of the space that you have available as well. If you're seed saving or planning on saving seeds to really kind of foster that full circle, self-reliance activity that we always talk about on the garden, then you're going to need to be able to plan in the number of plants that you're going to want to be saving for seed. And you want your seed to be coming from the very best plants, right? Those that are, clearly showing resistance to pests or diseases, those that are growing really well. And as much as you really want to, pick that plant, you really want to be leaving that one for seed. And in a smaller kind of backyard garden, you probably want to be saving seed from at least 1 plant, preferably around 5 healthy plants. So you need to be planning out that you're going to be saving seed from plants, and make sure that you mark those too. Because for plants that take more than 1 year to flower, so things like the brassica family, like kale, cabbage, mustards, also carrots, onions, leeks, those kind of plants, you want to be making sure that they're going to be growing where they need to be without being disturbed too much, but also like mark them both on the plant if you can, and in your garden journal, like these plants are for seeds. So, you don't have a helpful family member who's coming out to harvest something, for dinner, and they end up taking, the prize cabbage that you have been saving seed from, or at least planning on saving seed from, right? You definitely want to make sure that, you've got those planned into, your overall garden plan, because having that seed become available, that's obviously going to reduce your reliance from the seed companies, as well as, you're building resilience within your garden, right? You're going to be planting those genes that are going to be a lot more suited to the area that you're growing, and you're going to start to see that your garden is growing better and better, and you're going to be starting to build your own landrace and your own seed variety, which is incredibly exciting to be able to do. And I know There's people in the Facebook group who've got these really cool stories around their seeds so far. There's somebody who's saving seed from a lettuce variety that has done really well. There's somebody else who has some accidental cucumbers that were planted by their goats. I think that's such a great story. I mean, I have seeds from a tomato variety that I only grow at home and I don't share, but it was one that was accidentally planted by my dog, and it grew really, really well. And it's my dog that did that is no longer with us, unfortunately, so it's a funny reminder of him when we see those tomatoes coming through. But having a solid plan around your seed saving activities, as well as your overall growing to move away from the grocery store, is going to really help set you apart and help set you up for success in your garden. All right, so the other thing, and this will be the final thing that I want to talk about in moving towards more of a garden where you're relying solely on what is coming out of the garden, is that you need to plan and account for the right things growing in your garden. And by that I mean you need to think about calorie crops, sources of protein, sources of, calories, so carbohydrates. And you also need to account for, vitamins and minerals. And you need to be growing a selection of these things that are going to be ripening at various stages throughout the season to be able to keep you and your family, healthy, but also be able to keep you, away from needing to go to the store. So for calorie crops, it's things like, potatoes, rice, corn, right? Things that are higher in starches. But then also there's more unusual vegetables like Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes, which are, really good for a source of carbohydrates and calories, although you do need to eat them slowly at first and work them into your diet. Otherwise they can have some unexpected gaseous effects, we'll say. And definitely don't eat them before, you've got like a hot date or a really important job interview, because they do give you really bad gas if you're not used to eating them. But they're a really great resource, and they're something that's a perennial. They grow very readily in the garden. Like, they're native here to America, so they're dead easy to grow here. They also grow really easily in the UK. And they're a tuber, and they grow like a sunflower. They're part of the sunflower family, and they'll send up these really tall like stalks, and then towards the end of the season, around sort of late August to September, they'll have kind of like these sunflower-like heads on them. There'll be multiple flowers on there, and then after the frost, that's usually when you can start to harvest the tubers, and there'll be kind of a little sweetness about them. But when you're wanting to be growing food for your family and really moving away from the grocery store, you absolutely need to be thinking in terms of calories, because grains are not something that people really readily grow in their garden. Maybe they'll do, a little patch of popcorn or some sweet corn, and that's really about it. But, potatoes are a very easy to grow plant, very, very reliable to grow in most parts of the US. You'll need to be careful if you're growing somewhere that's humid, whether it's cold and humid or hot and humid, because blight is obviously a problem in those areas where, blight thrives on humidity and humid conditions. But potatoes are a really great source. You can grow them in containers as well as in the ground. So there's lots of ways that you can grow potatoes, but you don't just want to be relying on potatoes as being your only source of starches, right? You maybe want to think about having potatoes and sweet corn and a field corn and maybe Jerusalem artichokes, and maybe you want to try growing your own grains, which, by the way, you can absolutely grow grains in a small scale back garden. It is completely possible. I think the trick really comes in being able to use the grains afterwards, right? Growing the grains is easy, but it's being able to thresh out the seed and then grind them and use them in a way that's useful. That's where the tricky part comes in. And there's such a massive movement now to have like homegrown grains, and people have been like growing these little patches of wheat and then making their own bread from it. It's really quite exciting. And because of that, you're seeing more and more of these kind of smaller scale threshing tools becoming available, but also like mills and grinders and stuff. I mean, we have a grain mill already because we use it to crush our own grains for brewing, right? So the malts and stuff, those grains will typically go through a crusher, like to kind of grind them up a bit and just break them open, because then that helps to release the sugars in the malting and brewing process. So we want to be able to use that. So we already have that because we make a lot of beer, although we haven't for the last years, but maybe after we move we're going to get back into that. But yeah, having those tools available obviously helps you to make a better use of what it is that you're growing. But things like rice, you don't actually need to be having a flooded field to grow rice. There's many varieties of rice that are called upland rice, which means that you can grow them without the flooding, and they grow in lots of different areas of the US, and they're becoming a grain that is becoming a lot more readily available through seed catalogs. I've got a couple of varieties of rice from a seed company in upstate New York, for example, which I'm really excited to try in my next garden. I also have different varieties of wheat and barley and even oats. Like, I love oats. I have oatmeal every day. So growing my own oatmeal is pretty appealing to me. But, you do really need to think in terms of, calories and what it is that your family is going to be eating, and how you can grow a portion of that, because you're not going to be able to grow all of it, especially if you're in a suburban kind of setting. But you could absolutely use it, to make a small portion of it. And how great would that be, having a dinner party and, you've kind of grown your own bread and made it yourself from scratch, and everybody's there eating this beautiful sourdough. It's like, oh, this is amazing, this is like the best bread, like, where did you get it from? You're gonna be like, I made it myself, I grew it myself. But understanding that there are varieties of grains that you can absolutely grow at home. And here's the best bit, and here's a real good tip for you. If you're growing in a more intense gardening style, you can absolutely use the grains that you're going to be growing as part of those cover crops, and part of that sort of compost crop building that you need to do as part of that intensive gardening. Because what's going to happen with all that straw material after you've threshed off those wheat seeds, for example, well, it's going to go in the compost. It's a great source of carbon. You can then put something in the field, in the garden bed afterwards, right? That's going to help replenish some of those nutrients that are lost. And that's where the beans come in, right? And what are beans? Beans are a really great source of protein, right? They fix nitrogen in the air into the soil that then allows the plants to help use it. Nitrogen's responsible for that flush of beautiful green lush growth that you get. So having a really good understanding of crop rotations, as well as like what crops are going to be providing for your family, you can start to plan an appropriate source of food for your family. So remember, you're going to need some calories. So that's your calorie crops like potatoes, corn, wheat or rice, those kind of things. If you're growing grains, Jerusalem artichokes, right? You want to be growing those, and you want to be planning those in, so you're going to have those harvesting throughout the year, right? So you want to be having early potatoes, mid-season potatoes, late season potatoes, early corn, mid-season corn, late season corn. Maybe that might be early, mid and late sweet corn, but then also an early, mid and late field corn, right, that you can make hominy or tortillas or cornmeal from, right? Maybe you want to have some other grains coming in. So maybe you're wanting wheat, because you really want to make bread, and maybe you want to do a trial patch of rice, right? But having those planned in and knowing kind of when they're expected to be harvested, that's going to really help. Protein sources, we talked about beans, right? But legumes generally, so that's peas and beans. So things like garbanzo beans, drying beans, pole beans, peas, field peas, as well as, the normal kind of climbing peas. Also things like lentils. You can grow lentils from scratch. I've grown garbanzo beans or chickpeas for the first time in my garden, and that was incredibly exciting. I can't wait to harvest those seeds, and I'm going to save a few to resow next year in my new garden, but I'm going to thoroughly enjoy those in a chickpea and lemon soup that I like to do. But yeah, having a good source of protein, which is typically your pulses and beans, and working those in. And you can have bush beans and pole beans, and beans grow at different rates too. Obviously your soup and drying beans take a lot longer to mature because you let them dry on the vine, but at the same time you can be growing varieties that are perfect for fresh pickling. And, if you like pickle green beans, which we love, but also fresh eating green beans, and maybe mix it up and add in a couple of different varieties of beans that you're growing, but maybe add in a completely different plant. So maybe you've got your normal pole beans, but then you're also trying some of those Asian long beans to grow. Or maybe you're like I did, you're going to try growing garbanzo beans, but also you're growing your normal green beans, or you're drying beans like black beans or red beans or something like that. In terms of your vegetables and produce that is going to providing vitamins and minerals, now of course everything that we've just talked about is all going to be providing different vitamins and minerals, but some of them are growing a lot more vitamins and minerals than others, right? So your leafy greens, so we're talking collards, kales, cabbages, right? They're a great source of lots of different vitamins and minerals, right? They're a great source of calcium. They're a great source of things like vitamin K, right? They're full of lots of different nutrients that your body is going to need. So you want to make sure that you're growing some of these vegetables as well as, things for your calories and stuff. Other plants that are really great for nutrients, obviously tomatoes, right? They've got a lot of nutrients in them. Carrots, right? Things that are brightly colored often have a lot of really great phytonutrients. So those are nutrients that are produced by plants. Squashes. Now, winter squashes, particularly those that are like a really deep orange color on the inside in the flesh, they are a great source of carotenoids, so things like beta carotene, which is a form of vitamin A. They're a really good resource for that. But the beautiful thing about winter squashes is that they're also a really great source of calories too, right? They're very fibrous, and they have a lot of kind of starches and things in them. So winter squashes are a really amazing vegetable, and if you grow a different variety of winter squash, so you grow one that is part of the Cucurbita pepo family, which is usually your summer squashes, but also your field pumpkins, they grow, but they don't last very long in storage. Cucurbita maxima, which is the family of plants which like to grow these beautiful different shaped squashes, right? You often see them as some of those turban squashes or the buttercup squashes. Also, you kind of get some of those kind of bigger pumpkin varieties tend to be a maxima variety of squash. Those keep a bit longer than the pepo squashes, and they come in such an amazing diversity, different colors, different shapes, right? There's lots of those that are available. And then the final ones are the moschattas, so Cucurbita moschata, and those are typically associated with things like Seminole pumpkins, butternut squashes, the crooknecks, like is it a Pennsylvania crookneck squash? Those squashes keep the longest, and those have these beautiful, like, deep, firm flesh, which is really great for using in so many different recipes. But it's got an added bonus, right, that it can keep like up to 6 months if you cure the skins of the squash appropriately. So if you're really wanting to still be having like fresh vegetables to be eating throughout that kind of the hungry gap, right, you really want to be thinking about the squashes that you have. So if your muschatas will keep like up to kind of 6 months, your maximas tend to keep around like 3 months, 3 to 4 months, and your pepos will keep maybe a month, right? But having all of them kind of planted, they're not all going to cross-pollinate with each other. They'll only pollinate within their families. So the pepos will only cross-pollinate with the pepos, right? The maximas will only cross-pollinate with the maximas, and the muschatas will only cross-pollinate with the muschatas, right? Those are going to, help you have a lot more food that's available, and using their properties on the back end to be able to have like fresh vegetables throughout the season. So having a variety of plants that are growing is really good for you, right? It's good for what's available on the plate, and you're going to be getting that diversity of nutrients as well as calories throughout your growing season. And that's how you're going to be able to really provide like what your body needs whilst trying to stay away from the grocery store. The other thing about growing that diversity is that you're going to be able to account for things like loss for pests and diseases, right? Because you're going to have multiple things that are going to be growing at similar times, and having that plan in place, right? That plan that we talked about at the very beginning, right? Of these are all the plants that we're going to be needing, that my family like, they want to eat these things, but also when these things are going to be coming into harvest, right? So, if your first early potatoes are going to be ready in, I don't know, let's say middle of May, what else is going to be ready to eat in the middle of May? Are you just going to be having potatoes, or is there going to be peas that are ready at the same time because you planned those and planted them appropriately so that they would be? Do you have some early greens that are available? Like, is there kale available? Is there some leeks that are available, right? Having that planned in is going to be really helpful for you, so you're not just relying on, there's only one thing that is coming in the garden, like, what am I going to eat? Like, I've only got this one plant, and I really want to be able to be not going to the grocery store. So let's have a quick recap of what it is that we're going to need. So we need a really good plan, right? Really good plan for our garden, what's going to be growing, where it's going to be. We need to know our days to maturity of our plants, so we can plan when things need to be starting, when they need to be transplanted, and how long it is that they're going to be taking to grow and likely to produce a harvest. We need to account for different varieties. So what is it that we're wanting to use? Are we wanting to eat this plant fresh? Are we wanting to use it for storage on the back end? Are we wanting to use it for preserving? How many are we going to be needing per person per week? Right? So that's really getting into the details of like how many plants that you need, and then how many seeds do you need to be able to grow those. Because if your seed packet only comes with 20 seeds and you're needing like 40 plants, then you're going to need to make sure that you get more seeds, right? So having that planned in, the space, where is it going to be growing, what's going to be going in after it, and what's going to be growing before it, and then making sure that you have a diverse amount of veggies that are growing to be able to supply calories, protein, and those nutrients. I hope you found today's episode helpful. Please let me know in the Facebook group what it is that you're planning on growing in your next garden and what your garden goals are. And if you've been growing to supplement your food this year, what it is that has grown the best. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.